Feelings, attitudes, sensations, affect. There are many descriptions of what goes on, often invisibly, inside the human. Some are tangibly prompted from an external stimulus, such as pain upon touching something hot. Some are recognized as prompted from an internal stimulus, such as tears upon a painful memory. Sometimes no stimulus can be identified, as with some cases of depression. A theoretical impasse often occurs when scholars attempt to alternatively describe the emotional world, and when they, by contrast, try to explain it. Scarantino and D'Souza summarize the issue as follows. A widely shared insight is that emotions have components, and that such components are jointly instantiated in prototypical episodes of emotions. Consider an episode of intense fear due to the sudden appearance of a grizzly bear on your path while hiking. At first blush, we can distinguish, in the complex event that is fear, an evaluative component, appraising the bear as dangerous, a physiological component, increased heart rate and blood pressure, a phenomenological component, an unpleasant feeling, an expressive component, upper eyelids raised, jaw dropped open, a behavioral component, a tendency to flee, and a mental component, focusing attention. One question that has divided emotion theorists is, which subset of the evaluative, physiological, phenomenological, expressive, behavioral, and mental components is essential to the emotion? Those who consider the phenomenological aspect of emotion as most essential consider it a kind of bodily perception or subjective sensation. Early modern philosophers considered emotions essentially an invisible psychic entity. Cartesian dualism located this exclusively in the soul. Locke considered passions internal sensations, ultimately caused by good or evil. 19th and 20th century psychologists and neuroscientists reacted to this locating of emotions in a psychic entity by searching for a more scientific footing, by which they meant physiological and behavioral. The famous psychologist William James considered emotions the result of sensing bodily changes. We feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble. Damasio and Prince nuanced this, distinguishing between the emotion as registering the bodily change, while still distinct from the bodily change. The question of labeling emotion divides scholars. How does emotion relate to these various aspects? Can we say that bodily change causes emotion, or that emotion causes bodily change? Many scholars today claim these are the wrong questions. They are the wrong questions because, as Barrett writes, emotions themselves have no ontological status. What has an ontological status is an inner state which is recognized and slotted into an emotional category. Russell considers emotion a mental pairing of ongoing affect, this inner physiological state, with a pattern or mental script, and when they are paired, the affect is labeled emotion. Consequently, to perceive oneself as afraid is to see a resemblance between one's current state and a mental script for that emotion. As hinted at, the term that has risen to favor within the sciences is now affect. On its own, it may be used as a synonym of feeling, the third pillar of psychology, alongside behavior and cognition, or a synonym for the phenomenological components of an emotional episode, or as core affect. Core affect is our focus here. Core affect is a preconceptual primitive process, a neurophysiological state, accessible to consciousness as a simple non-reflective feeling good or bad, feeling lethargic or energized. There is something it is to feel core affect. Its presence in consciousness varies from being focal to peripheral to out of sight. In scientific language, core affect can be thought of as a neurophysiologic barometer of the individual's relationship to an environment at a given point in time. The self-reported feelings are the barometer readings. Core affect is a direct, uninterpreted, physiologically irreducible experience. That is, every person always has a current internal state. The question of stimulus is moot, regardless of whether it is externally prompted or internally prompted, There's always a current internal state. As we will see, emotion is a complex recipe, but core affect is the ingredient science can now track. Although irreducible in and of itself, the different states that one experiences as core affect may be fruitfully compared along two particular dimensions on what is now called the affective circumplex. The first is a spectrum from pleasure to displeasure, or unpleasant to pleasant, called hedonic valence. And the second is arousal, a spectrum of activation from arousing to subduing, or activation to deactivation. The vertical axis is the energy level, and the horizontal axis the pleasantness. This circumplex, with the dimensions of pleasantness and energy, has been repeatedly shown to be scientifically powerful and useful to describe core affect, but it must be stressed that this does not imply any correspondence with how the affect came about. This is only descriptive, not explanatory. If core affect is thus grasped sufficiently to describe it, what is to be done about emotion? Scholars variously consider emotion a categorizing of core affect, or core affect plus other ingredients into recognizable entities. This allows for different cultures to categorize the same affect differently. For example, the core affect that manifests in a strained facial expression may be interpreted by one culture as anger, but by another as grief. Meaning the same physiologically internal state, the core affect, expressed physically in the same way by a particular facial expression, may be interpreted differently in different cultures. Scientifically, the affect and the expression of the affect are the same. It would be the same set of coordinates on the affective circumplex as shown on this more complex version. But different cultures would interpret the emotion differently, and thus put different labels onto that same set of coordinates. This means that the labels you see here are those assigned by the scholars who generated this chart, and which align well with educated Western culture. The view of emotion is thus changing from an entity unto itself, which can be objectively studied, to a socially constructed pattern based on familiar perception. That is, a real phenomenon, but one that has no independent existence. Russell compares emotions to constellations. They are a real pattern, but they're not an objective entity of scientific interest. Astronomers do not bother themselves with constellations because they see them as purely epiphenomenal. Emotion is thus falling out of favor with scientists as not a valid scientific object of research. They will content themselves with core affect. But the constellation of emotion nonetheless remains a necessary object of literary and translation research. Epiphenomenal or not, emotions are a vital part of human communication. How they are derived is therefore of the greatest interest. Whereas previous scholars had proposed that emotions are generally generated biologically by nature or sociologically by nurture, Russell proposes what he calls psychological construction, which includes both nature and nurture, but more importantly, psychological. The experience of having an emotion is, in his terms, a meta-experience. Based on the raw data of core affect, somatosensory feedback, appraisal of the situation, etc., a psychological construct is formed which is given the culturally appropriate label of a given emotion. We recognize this constellation as fear. We might be able to grant, therefore, that affect exists scientifically and objectively in a way emotion does not. But emotion exists even if only as a psychological construct, and it therefore is of just as much interest as affect, even if by a different flavor of scholarship. The connection pertinent for us is that a psychological construct is meaningful. The idea of labeling a series of behaviors, perceptions, or feelings attributes to them a given meaning. Meaning is the bridge between cognition and language, as well as between language and culture. Meaning is componential, but, as many have argued, not infinitely so. Anna Wiertzbicke has argued for a bottom layer of semantic components, the elements of meaning, which are themselves indivisible. These she calls semantic primitives, which are now the base of the natural semantic metalanguage approach. The practical end is a plain language paraphrase, in terms of a small, standardized set of simple words that is used to express meaning. The test of validity for such plain language paraphrases is twofold. It must make intuitive sense to native speakers, and it must make sense as a whole, being coherent. Here's how natural semantic metalanguage would express the complexity of the verb to kill. When we say that X killed Y, what we intend is someone X did something to someone else Y. Because of this, something happened to Y at the same time. Because of this, something happened to Y's body. Because of this, after this, Y was not living anymore. You can see the simultaneous simplicity and clarity of thought, while allowing for significant underspecification. There was no direct assumption that X intended that Y die, or that X was personally involved. X did something, and Y ended up dying. This is the intuitive sense and coherent summary of the meaning of the word kill. Without agreeing with the presuppositions and conclusions involved in natural semantic metalanguage, we can appreciate the need for semantic primitives shared by given languages and cultures, even if they are not universal. In order to be able to translate, languages and cultures must share concepts, and natural semantic metalanguage has helpfully laid out some principles for assessing the successful communication of the same idea in different languages. Parallel to the program of semantic primitives is another, of emotional primitives, seeking characteristic or prototypical cognitive scenarios involving thoughts and wants. Iconic constellations, if you will. The proposal for to be sad is here. Someone X felt something bad. Someone can feel something like this when this someone thinks like this. I know that something bad happened. I don't want things like this to happen. I can't think like this. I will do something because of it now. I know that I can't do anything. The prototypical cognitive scenario, Goddard writes, involves an awareness that something bad happened, not necessarily to me, and an acceptance of the fact that one can't do anything about it. This is compatible with the wide range of use of sad, for example, that I may feel sad when I hear that my friend's dog died, or when I think about some unpleasant bickering in my workplace. Well, as noted above, an essential leap forward made with core affect was linking the same core affect across cultures to different interpretations in terms of emotion, which is in potential conflict with this program of emotional primitives. But without further commenting on that, we can observe how their conclusion, that feelings are linked with characteristic or prototypical cognitive scenarios, aligns strikingly with the conclusions of Russell and those adherents of the theory of core affect. In both cases, there are real identifiable components of situations which are culturally and characteristically or prototypically labeled with a given emotion. This begins to be good ground for addressing the question of emotions in an ancient text, as in the Hebrew Bible. What we really mean is, can we identify emotions as the original audience would have labeled the situation? This becomes one of two possibilities. Can we identify the various components of the situation, as pertains to any given character, and assess the emotion label that would have been applied by the original audience? Or, skipping over reconstructing the emotion, can we identify an emotion label being applied in the text? I here presuppose that emotions are, by definition, present in all cultures and are culturally defined. It is precisely that culturally defined psychological construct that we dare hope we might grasp, because language is built on units of meaning, and the very aim of language is to grasp and indeed give meaning to culturally defined constructs. The two possibilities for identifying emotions lead directly into the observations and principles that undergird this work. 1. The written text of the Psalms, and likely much of the Hebrew Bible, is a verbal reduction of an intended oral performance. As with the proverbial iceberg, any given text is only the visible part of the entire situation we are seeking to recover. The text may be the extent of our tangible evidence, but it is not the entirety of the situation. 2. Doing justice to the text requires placing it in its ancient context, chronologically, geographically, and culturally. This we recover as best we can by looking at the entire Hebrew Bible, buttressed by historical, archaeological, and other scholarly studies. 3. From this ancient context, we must reconstruct cultural norms that will enable us to anticipate default emotion in many situations. For instance, water has different associations in the ancient world than for many in the modern world today, so mention of water will arouse different default emotions. And 4. If ancient context and cultural norms are the background, the text is the foreground to identify emphases or deviations from cultural norms in terms of emotion. The first 3 principles apply to recovering on our own what emotion the culture would have labeled a given situation. The 4th is where the text is explicit, either to deviate from or confirm the cultural norm. Recovering a biblical Hebrew mindset is the holy grail of most biblical scholarship and not to be passed over lightly. By the same token, there is no one method, or even a handful of methods, that can claim a monopoly. Our goal here is not to do fresh scholarship in terms of establishing these norms, but to build on top of existing scholarship in order to make new discoveries in the field of emotion. One fruitful avenue of research for understanding the biblical Hebrew mindset is that of conceptual metaphor theory. Jim Polig writes, "At the heart of this theory is the concept of embodiment, that metaphors of all kinds are grounded in one's interaction with oneself and with the surrounding environment. The more grounded human reasoning is in this type of interaction, the more embodied it is said to be. The value in identifying such metaphors is in grasping the unconscious mental manipulation of a target domain in terms of a source domain, and thereby exposing a cultural and linguistic knowledge base of a community. When the wicked are likened to chaff, much rich domain knowledge about plants and agriculture is immediately available to inform the discussion. In order to establish cultural norms, we lean explicitly on such works as the Semantic Dictionary of Biblical Hebrew, as well as ongoing work in conceptual metaphors, in addition to the traditional body of scholarship. Once the cultural norms have been established, we turn to the text in question itself. Speech act analysis, in simplified form, has been highly productive in exposing the specific cognitive scenario involving thoughts and wants that enables us to identify emotions in a text. The labels applied to an affect circumplex reflect precisely the socially constructed emotion that a society understands to derive from this kind of affect. On this version, we can see, for example, that negative, low-energy core affect is associated with being miserable, sad, and depressed. Positive, low-energy core affect is associated with being pleased or glad. And positive, high-energy core affect is associated with being delighted, excited, or even astonished. Because we are dealing with reconstructed emotions from a literary text, and from a culture not our own, one might ask the utility of a scientific neurophysiological model such as that of core affect. Its utility lies in understanding that there is a genuinely embodied reality that lies behind emotions, which we here call core affect, even if that part of emotion beyond core affect is socially defined. For those who would perform the text, they need to both locate the neurophysiological reality, that they might reproduce it in embodied form, as well as grasp socially the whole psychological construct of the emotion, the story behind the physiological state. Having thus literally plotted the scientific part of emotion as core affect, always aware that we're starting from our own cultural assumptions until we have evidence of where the Hebrew cultural assumptions differ, we next need to plot the social and cultural concept of emotion as available to us through literary texts. The interconnectedness of components that make up emotion may be helpfully analyzed into the categories of 3 semantic primes: think, feel, and do. In Psalm 6, for instance, the fear and distress derive from what is thought and are reflected in what is done. The thought that I may die prompts fear, which manifests itself in trembling. The same thought brings distress, also manifest in trembling. This is the constellation referred to by Nivhala in Psalm 6:4b. The thought that people oppose me prompts both distress and anger, which is the constellation referred to by Katlas. Once we've identified emotions, which tend to be our fuel column, another set of dimensions captures our interests, regarding not the quantitative assessment of core affect, but rather the qualitative, textual expression of emotion. This leads us to two new dimensions, the intensity of the expression and the explicitness of the expression. While affect is plotted according to the physiological energy or activation inherent to the affect, such as lower energy for depression and higher energy for anger, we use intensity to refer to the literary and cultural perception of an emotion. If we take the idea of sadness, which would be plotted as an unpleasant, slightly low energy affect, we find there are multiple levels of intensity within the sadness. Other scholars have captured these progressions with the cultural concept of emotion, such as in Plutchik's Wheel of Emotion. In the dark blue, we can see the larger concept of sadness is conceived of as a progression from pensiveness at the outside through sadness to grief at its most intense. If we look at the affect circumplex, however, there is no similar progression to match this change in intensity. In the interpretation here, pensiveness is a slightly positive, though low energy emotion, whereas sad and depressed are closely positioned, with sad just a bit more negative than depressed. This highlights the difference between the cultural assessment of a progression, from pensive to sad to grief, and the physiological assessment of the underlying core affect, which all share similar energy levels. Plutchik tried to align his intensity levels with the activation energy dimension of the affect circumplex, but we can see he was actually identifying something quite different. Not the physiological energy of core affect, but rather the culturally perceived intensity of the culturally defined emotion. Sad may be the generic term for sadness, with pensive a not-so-intense sadness, and sorrowing referring to great sadness, whereas grief-stricken is extreme sadness. These are all tied together culturally as gradations of intensity of the emotion of sadness. Wheels of emotion, such as Plutchik's, demonstrate the recognition of emotions recognized within Western culture. How do we reconstruct the cultural equivalent for ancient Hebrew culture? This is a field ripe for study, and we're only making initial forays. The second dimension of textual analysis of emotion is the explicitness in the text. Just how explicit is the connection between the words of the text and the emotion depicted? We've set up three prototypical categories, whether the emotion is openly expressed, or lexically described, or simply culturally elicited. Expression is prototypically with interjections, "Woe is me!" Description is when the lexical item for the emotion is employed, as in, "His delight is in the law of the Lord," describing the man's delight, or mockers, as those who adopt a mocking attitude. This interplay of attitude and emotion should be noted, as if attitude is to emotion what the climate is to the weather. When we speak of norms, we thus speak of attitudes, but an instantiation of an attitude manifests itself emotionally. When we use literary analysis to identify emotion, therefore, we're claiming to have identified a cultural and social phenomenon, a psychological construct primarily based in a physiologically real state called core affect. In Psalm 1:1, this looks like reading, in the Semantic Dictionary of Biblical Hebrew, that the first word, ashrei, the construct of ashrim, includes an attitude of admiration on behalf of the speaker. This admiration would map on the affective circumplex to being impressed, which is plotted about a third of the way from neutral to pleasant and with slightly less energy than neutral. The text of Psalm 1 begins with a description of this man whom the psalmist is admiring, and the description culminates in a rather fantastical description of a tree that is untouched by difficulties in life, because it has a reliable stream of water, so it never suffers drought, blight, or any damage. It prospers regardless of human or natural disaster. The conceptual metaphor is people are plants, in which a plant's life cycle and success or failure are mapped onto people. The plant's worth is determined by its ability to produce both fruit and foliage, and the complete success of the tree conveys the wild success in store for the man who devotes himself to Torah. The very descriptors, fantastical and wild, convey the growth in both activation energy and intensity which could be newly plotted as astonishment on the circumplex. In literary terms, the two seem to be connected, and here's the beginning of identifying the Hebrew cultural concepts of emotion. Our hypothesis is that emotional movement within a psalm will reveal cultural concepts and progressions, so any emotional movement is a possible reflection of underlying cultural connections. For the sake of literary analysis, we're thus content to identify a literary connection, as between the admiration and awe, but we're also alert to the possibility of a deeper cultural connection. The admiration introduced in verse 1 has therefore intensified to what one might describe as awe. In terms of both affect energy as well as emotional intensity, there's a distinct increase. In terms of textual explicitness, however, there is a decrease. Whereas the lexical definition of ashrim included the attitude of admiration, there's nothing lexical in the tree's success to include awe. The awe comes from the cultural paradigms of success and failure and the literary depiction of this legendary tree. The net result may be seen in the first part of this table, in which a state of first admiring and then awed is depicted in pink for the psalmist in Psalm 1. They share the same color because they are connected textually and literarily, but the awe has a greater saturation in order to convey its increased intensity. The ashrim on the right is medium gray because it is lexically described, whereas the rest of the emotions are only elicited, and so they are in light gray. As can be seen, the other emotional trajectory identified for the psalmist is from disgust to condemnation to rejection. And again, there is a progression in intensity. To conclude, we are using emotional exegesis as shorthand for recovering the emotions either expressed, described, or elicited in the text that are today recognized as vital to a faithful performance of the text. By emotion, we mean the culturally defined psychological construct that is primarily based on and manifest in core affect, the plotting scheme preferred by scientists. The usefulness of the scientific plotting is to capture the neurophysiological element, the inner state, while also permitting the overlay of cultural interpretation. There is so much new territory here that we're forced to do much instinctively, but we are hopeful of establishing new methods that can be refined over time to define well just what it means to engage in emotional exegesis. Come tomorrow morning if you'd like to hear more. Thank you.